Hello and welcome to this episode. Today I am joined by Stuart Buchanan, Global Brand Ambassador for Benriach. Now, Stuart, it's great to see you. There's obviously been a few little changes to Benriach recently, and I was hoping you'd be able to tell us a little bit about them, about the new packaging, the new formulation of the whiskies themselves, and of course, how all this ties back to Benriach's Speyside heritage.
And I think that's a great thing, even, Christopher, when we look at the range today, because it really does touch the whole of the Benriach heritage, right back to 1898 when it was founded. And it's almost, we're taking all these lovely cues and notes from the past and really bringing it into the modern day whisky shelf in the new Benriach clothes, as you mentioned. And that's what I love about the core range here. You can almost taste through them, and every layer of that flavour profile, you can say that's a nod to this part of the history, that's a nod to this part of the heritage. And that for me is a great honesty when it comes to rebranding, etc. So it really has been an exciting time. And even just to start off with the creative, for example, Benriach goes right back to 1898. Unfortunately, it was hit by the Patterson crash, the earlier part of the century, 1900, 1901. And then, as others did, it reopened in 1965. So there was no real, I suppose, core range of Benriach produced. The only time Benriach was bottled as a distillery's own bottling was in 1994 under the Seagram's ownership. And that is, maybe some of you viewers out there will be familiar with this packaging here. So that's the old Seagram's 1994. And then if you actually just take a wee look at our new creative, I think it's, there's no denying where we're getting the inspiration from. So taking all these lovely cues, that lovely subtle duck egg blue, the little red highlights, for example, and just bringing what was that only distillery edition into a modern space on the shelf. So I like it when you can nod to the heritage, even creative as well as whiskey itself. And I think when it comes to Benriach, the world's your oyster, because all the work that we've done back in the days, not even in the last 16 years since we moved it from a silent period into production back in 2004, but even to have the styles of spirit back to the 70s, early 70s, doing a highly peated barley in the floor maltings of Benriach. I don't think there's any other Speyside that has aged, high level peat production in their warehouses. So it's great to have that. Even if you look at through the 1990s, triple distillation, great to have that also. And such a, I think, fruit forward nature of the Benriach classic spirit, which really is its own thumbprint and DNA. So if you're a master blender like Rachel Barrie, you go into that warehouse 13 particularly, the ingredients you've got to play with there are endless. The possibilities are endless in how you can, create flavors within 1 dram. So we can only take credit for what we've done in the last 16 years, but there's a lot before that that's actually coming into play in these expressions.
That's fantastic. So you really delved deep into the spirit there. So thank you very much for that. But obviously you talked a little bit about the cut points and how exactly that spirit character is achieved. But obviously there's quite a bit that happens before that distillation process. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about fermentation and the mashing process as well at the distillery.
Yep, and it's something that I love. Coming from production myself, I started off in production, really opening up Benriach back in 2004. And even as we got the production going, it took roughly 6 months actually from April to roughly September 2004 to get the place up and running. We then actually looked at the spirit and made a few certain little tweaks in the production process to even drive more of the classic DNA of Benriach forward. So, we have got a very high mineral rich water from an aquifer just behind us, 100-metre borehole. Beautiful mineral content in there. And if you know your water, if you know the advantages that your water can bring, you can start changing other parts of the process to harness that and drive it further forward. So 4-water mashing, for example, nice lower temperatures than a normal 3-water mash system. I feel we're giving the barley a happier place to be. You know, we're keeping it relaxed. We're not tightening up the barley itself, giving us a beautiful, I think, what I feel is one of the sweetest and clearest worts I've ever seen coming from a mash tun. And I think even at that point there, okay, we know we can do that. What else can we do? You go into fermentation, always looking closely at the wort temperature, because we do long fermentation, so you want the creation of these esters and the fermentation rates to be correct. So pushing out the fermenters, almost looking in the fermenters in the wash for a green apple skin. And for me, that's where the orchard fruit journey starts, is actually in that wash. So if the mash tun, what that's going to bring is the very forward maltiness, which I love, which you will get in the expressions. The fermentation style, pushing that out, stainless steel's fermenters as well. That for me is building the orchard fruits. And then through distillation, I suppose one thing we did there was just play around with the middle cut, you know, pushing that back and forward, seeing where the sweet spot was to again accentuate the classic flavours of Benriach. And I suppose we had luxury of time. We slowed down, which meant we could boil the stills slower. We could push that middle cut out larger. So a short 4 shots, going on early, getting the big high esters, leaving it on longer, going into the sweet barley again. So at every stage in production, we're driving to really expand the flavour possibilities in the production itself. So when you taste the new make spirit, which I have here, this is not hand sanitizer, this is the new make spirit. Put in your hand there, straight away. I've never smelt such a fruit forward spirit. I really haven't. You can say orchard fruits, and a lot of people will say orchard fruits, but it's more than that. It's even moving into the overripe bananas in there, the almost touches of the not quite pineapple, but moving towards that. Also more pear than maybe green apple. So that's that lovely orchard fruit that we are talking about, Benriach. And also it's not an oily spirit. It's a nice kind of dryish spirit actually, which I think also means when you go through to cask, you're going to have a more open nature of maturation through there. So if you know your spirit well, which I think every distillery manager and distiller at Benriach has done, you can then, I think, know which cask it's going to perform best in. And that's the one thing about this spirit. It's got broad shoulders. It can carry a lot of weight. Although it's not oily, it's viscous with almost syrupy nature to it, you know. So if you know that spirit, you can start pushing it in different directions. And I think that's why the master distillers of the 70s knew they could use highly peated barley here and it would still remain Benriach. In the 90s, they knew you could do triple distillation and it would still remain Benriach. And then when we take over 2004 and do that fantastic work in cask maturation, we know you can put a lot on its shoulders and it still remains Benriach. Knowing your spirit is the first thing. That's what you've got to understand. And then you can start having fun.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Stuart. What I really love about this is that this new range has such an incredible variety of different flavours. But what I'd like to explore a little bit with you is if you strip back all of these different cask types that Rachel Barrie's used, what do you feel is the real house style, the spirit style of Benriach?
Yeah, the mashing is great. You know, I've never smelt a sweeter mash house. You know, you go into the turn room area. Everything is an experience as you walk through Benriach. And that's just to go aside for the question for a second. When you walk through Benriach, when you're standing in the maltings, you want to smell that in the whiskey. Sorry, yeah. When you're standing in the mash tun, you want to smell that in the whiskey. When you're standing at the washbacks, you want to smell that in the whiskey. So as you walk through the distillery itself, you get such an experience of flavour that you don't want to mask. So you do want to get that in the spirit. And that's what I say to people when they visit a distillery. Don't just walk around and look. Smell what's happening. You know, smell the aroma around you. And then when you taste the whiskey, try and find that aroma of a distillery in your whiskey. And that's what I love. But to your question at first, yeah, 4-water mashing. I think what it allows us to do is just when you lower that temperature profile across the water infusions, you're just actually changing the enzymes that you're going to be able to create. So a lot of people forget that I love it. Mashing, there's so many little things in mashing you can do which change the proteins, the enzymes, the starches, and the soluble aspect of that. And by doing that lower temperature profile, for me, definitely offers such a sweet nature of that barley coming through in the wort. I've never seen anything like it in clarity, as well as in flavour, nose and taste. And then the washbacks, stainless steel washbacks. It's always that old argument, who's got the best washbacks, wooden or stainless steel? We've got both across our 3 distilleries. So, I'm not going to say one's better than the other, but the message there is they're different, and as long as you utilise them in different ways, you can gain different flavour styles. I think with stainless steel, you can definitely push them longer. You're not getting that the quicker secondary bacterial fermentation, for example, just due to the kind of sterile conditions of them. So you can generally push a stainless steel fermenter longer, which the esters you're going to create start moving into that green, crisp green apple note. I always, if you talk about beer, I always think about moving it into what would be a lambic guza, That's the kind of what I'm looking for when I'm tasting it. Lovely and tart, lovely and fresh, lovely and bright. And also, and the great thing about long fermentations is the yeast is totally dead. It's all settled to the bottom as a sludge. So when you're actually taking that through to your stills, you're in essence taking through what is a semi-filtered wash, because all the dead yeast has settled to the bottom, which again, in distillation, beautiful, clean boil. You get it's a funny term, but when your stills get dirty inside, you call it when your stills get furred up. The dead yeast that's maybe in the body of a shorter fermentation, which coats the inner surface of that still, then inhibiting the copper contact. Now we don't have that problem, so we're able to boil slowly, beautiful interaction, contact with that copper, and actually when you take it into this safe, I've never seen such a green spirit safe with the build-up of that verdigris. When you see sometimes a little bit of verdigris in a still or in a spirit safe, ours is almost bright green, showing you how much copper we're stripping even at that part of the process. So yeah, that so many little things, and that's what whiskey should be. It should be not just one thing, it should be all these little things that just add up to make each distillery process different. And it's not that one's good or one's better or one's worse, they're just different.
So does that mean that you get through stills more often at Benriach? Do you have to replace parts of the stills because of that high level of copper contact and therefore the increased amount of wear?
Well, we've just done that last year actually, and it was a bit of a shaky moment because, when you do your ultrasound thickness tests, we were down to about 0.4 at one point in one of the spirit stills. And just to get us through to the shutdown, we had to actually shore up internally with almost a scaffold structure to get us through to the next shutdown. So it's hard to tell. They were put in probably 65, although there was a lot of downtime in that period. So the equation would be there. I think we do rip more copper from that. The Benriach style.
So people might know that Benriach is situated in Speyside, but obviously Speyside, though it's a very famous whisky producing region, is a pretty large area. Could you tell us a little bit more about where exactly Benriach is situated and how that environment impacts the whisky?
Yes, so Benriach sits at the top of the Speyside region. So I'm in Elgin at the moment, so I'm only 3-4 miles away from Benriach. So I suppose we come under that, the northern cluster of distilleries in Speyside. But it's a beautiful location. Benriach itself means Ben being the hill or the mountain, and Riach refers to, it's a funny word, it refers to actually the colour of the heather in the winter. Riach itself is an old Scots stroke Gaelic word for grey or dappled or speckled, so it does refer to the kind of colour in the heather of winter. But so the Benriach does sit slightly higher than maybe the other distilleries around us, so it's got a nice prominent position. Also Speyside, as people know, it's the warmest and sunniest place in Scotland when you're visiting, and I think that has got a lot to do with even the Speyside style, you know, it is definitely a drier climate. Probably less rainfall from anywhere else in Scotland. I'm not saying it's the warmest, but it's probably got a more gentle climate through that Spey Valley. So I think there's a lot of things that come together in Speyside and particularly Benriach when you add in the water factor. You know, water is your major need, and with that high minerality of the water, again, warehouse is sitting in the Spey Valley there, beautiful conditions. It's almost that Goldilocks effect where everything's just coming together at that right time. And also Benriach sat right beside the railway line. So there was a railway from Glenlossie, which was also one of John Duff's distilleries, with same founder as Benriach. And that ran from 2 miles away from Glenlossie, across the road to Benriach. Then it actually passed Longmorn and then onto the main Speyside line. So really you had everything you needed on your hand. Another quick reason, I think that's also why Benriach started doing peated expressions back in the 70s, because the peat initially came from what was called the Moss of Burney, which is a big peat bog up almost between Cardew and Elgin and Burney, area of Burney. And that would also have been perfect for the cutting of the peat in the hill there, only about 6 miles away, taking it down to Glenlossie, onto that train, then dropping it off at the floor maltings of Benriach. So again, it's just another addition to the link that made it feasible and I think possible for Benriach to do that peated whiskey right back in the early 70s. And that would have been the style that would have been created back in 1898 as well.
So you mentioned the peat there. Peat is playing a really important role in this new range with the smoky expressions. But can you tell us a little bit more about the peat that actually goes into Benriach? Because obviously there's quite a big difference between peat taken from different parts of the country. So Aberdeenshire peat is different from Speyside peat, Orkney peat is different from Islay peat. What is it that makes the peat that goes into the Benriach special, and how does that influence the flavours?
Yeah, and it's funny because I even talking to some of the old distillers that were there right back in the 70s and 80s, a lot of guys who a lot of whiskey people were familiar with, although I won't mention any names, who maybe started off their careers as brewers at Benriach. So it's been great to have an insight into that level of knowledge that these guys have. So back in the 70s, when they did first, start using the higher, highly peated barley, it was coming from the Burney, the Moss of Burney, high level, inland, very much more a fibrous vegetation. So again, the vegetation far more root structures, for example. But then through the 80s, it's you never want to exhaust one peat bog. So the peat bogs have kind of continually moved almost every decade, and throughout the 80s. The peat was then coming from the Tomontoul area, further south, further up into the kind of foothills of the Cairngorms. And I can't tell you what the structure of that was, but I can tell you in taste, when I taste some of those 80s peated expressions, let me say it's got slightly more herbaceous note, for example, that's coming through it. So definitely from the slightly west Moss of Burney is, with age, has become so elegant, so refined, so almost gentle in its approach in the palate. That's going to come with age also. But then when we go to the 80s, definitely a slightly more herbal note running through there. But now we've actually moved slightly more east, which then goes back to the lovely sweet smoky style of peat, just through to the vegetation. And you're talking about, I suppose it'll be, deforestation as the vegetation. It's the Caledonian forests 1,000 years ago, which we're now taking from the peat layers underneath us and burning in the kiln. I do have a little bit of it here, and even you hold this close up, you can see far more root structure, for example. Bits of bark, bits of twig, and you almost class peat in texture more than anything else. So if you go to some peat bogs in Islay, for example, if you're digging deep down, you rub it between your fingers and you'll call that buttery. It'll melt between your fingers, and it's almost that texture you scale peat with. But here, that's so fibrous. It really is. It's so thick with that vegetation. And you've got to remember also, the more wood that's in there, it's almost like burning or charring your barrels. You're getting the same vanillins almost coming from the wood structure here, as you would be getting in maybe the toasting of the cask or the charring of the cask. So they're not fighting each other. The cask and the peat is going to bring together actually in some ways similar notes.
There's actually one last question I'd like to ask you about peat, which is to do with the running of the kilns and the humidity of the barley at the time of peating. I understand that those two things are factors that can influence the final ppm level of the barley after the kilning process. So is that something that you could tell me a little bit about in relation to Benriach?
Well, it's funny because as much as, again, we've brought in a lot of the old-time guys who worked in the floor maltings, and that was great to get their experience firsthand. We ourselves have not tried peating at the floor maltings again yet. We got it up and running in 2012, and we've been doing a small annual production at the floor maltings with unpeated, but we've not quite had the time to dedicate to saying, okay, let's try some peated. I'm sure we'll do it at some point, but I think when it goes back to even the kilning of peat, I think there's so many differences of opinion in the camps. Do you do it early when it's still damp? Do you do it halfway through? Do you do it later? I don't think anybody would give you the ultimate answer to that. It's very much a personal approach, and it might even do with how the kiln draws, or it could be details in there of even how the fire draws. It makes these little differences. So yeah, it's a good question, but very difficult to answer.
Okay, so this floor malted barley, it's not being drip fed into other expressions in the range. It is actually being ring fenced and kept for a special release in the future then.
Yeah, and it's funny. Well, they were actually, I think, the reason that the distillery actually survives to this day, because the downtime after the Patterson crash, the distillery sitting empty from basically 1900 to 1965. The floor maltings were in operation, although the distillation had stopped. The floor maltings were still operational, so they worked from 1898 right through to 1998. And I guarantee you, if it wasn't for that case, I reckon Benriach would have been flattened throughout the 30s or 40s or something, and maybe became just a warehouse complex for other Speyside distilleries. So I think that's a great thing, that the floor maltings has actually made it possible to have Benriach today, or be able to open the distillery up. But that was a full 100 years, 1898 to 1998. It's about a 10-ton floor, very traditional, not one bit of automation or modernisation in there. That was actually one of my last projects before leaving production to go into my ambassadorial capacity, was getting that recommissioned. And we had to do very little. I think all I really had to do as far as replacing machinery, it was basically fuses. It was a fuse box I had to put in rather than the machinery itself, and everything works off one main motor, and it's all the lovely pulleys and belt systems, etc. So you can't get more traditional. Nice big concrete, steeps at the bottom. So it really is a great nod to that heritage as well. And even to this day, we don't run it all the time. We've got a small window in spring where we operate it, just making sure that we don't want to lose the heritage there. It'd be such a shame to lose such an iconic part, that even though we're only doing maybe 6-8 weeks production annually in the floor maltings, I would rather that than turning it into a visitor centre, for example. So yeah, and in the future we will have a fully floor malted expression coming through, so that's something to look forward to. And I think once Rachel's worked with the casks and see how she can bring different flavours together with different barrel sizes, for example, we will bring that out as a malt season exclusive, so a small batch, and go high ABV on that. But I think that you've got to be more gentle on the floor malted barley, because it does really hold a very different nuance to the spirit. It's almost like the barley is a bit more earthier coming through on it. Almost it's a funny one to describe, but almost dusty. You get a dust off the barley, and it's that a bit slightly more earthy. That's the best word I can think of it. So, and you don't want to overload that with casks. So these are nuances that we want to keep in that spirit and in maturation to really let that shine through. I'm really looking forward to that one coming out. And again, it's a nice personal one for myself, after starting the maltings up. So that'll be a nice another one for me of one of my favourites in the list. But yeah, so the floor malting's great experience to have it. We are operating it throughout the April, May months, whenever weather dictates, when we can start that. Generally after we're away from the first frost, and that will be a small batch running through April, May. It's great because there's, again, lots of visitors to Speyside at that time. They can pop in, have a tour, get a shot of the shovel, pull the rake, for example. So it's great to have that experience for the guests to come and see, as well as for us to make the spirit from it. That was a decision we made right back in 2012. If we're going to do it properly and make it identifiable to be floor malted barley. So that was a decision back then, and it paid off. I tell you, one thing it maybe did give us a problem is you've got to be more careful with the bed as far as the drainage in the mash tun, because it grinds slightly differently. It'll grind a bit drier, a bit more friable. So you've got to be more gentle in how you grind that floor malted barley, but also when you're setting the bed of your mash tun, you've got to be, I think, very precise and not make it a disruptive bed. Give you a nice bed so you get a good drainage, because drainage can be a problem when you're working with a finer, maybe dusty or more flowery grist, for example.
That's great. So it's fantastic to hear about how you were involved in setting up the floor maltings at the distillery, and you've alluded a couple of times to your history in the production side of the industry. So could you tell me a little bit more about your career and how you got into the whisky industry?
Very organically, actually. I've never applied for a job since I was 22. It just came, or it was one of these cases, it was just, do you want to do it? Do it. Or sometimes just do it. And I just did it. So, it started off in Tobermory over on the west coast, my hometown. Started there as a stillman, turned 23 years old actually. But yeah, no great ambitions to move anywhere. I was quite happy being a stillman in Tobermory, to be honest. Great place to live. And then when Billy Walker, that was a director of Burn Stewart at that time, he'd actually left Burn Stewart, and then myself and Alan McConaughey were approached by Billy to go up and start Benriach back in 2004. Didn't really have to think about it. I thought, well, why not? New challenge. I'm always up for a challenge. So I left in my car and one bag of clothes and one bag of books, and that was me up in Speyside. A little bit daunting, I'll tell you. Turning up at Benriach, hadn't been operating for 2 years. There was tumbleweed blowing through the lanes between the warehouses, and goodness knows when the last time the distillery was painted. I think it was in the 60s, because it was lime greens and citric oranges, as far as the colours of tanks and vessels, for example. So yeah, it was a bit daunting. But yeah, I would say we didn't even switch anything on for 2 months. The first 2 months were purely cleaning, clean down, strip down, build back up, right, let's push a button, see what happens. And probably took us best part of 6 months to actually physically start production. So that was a great learning curve. I think if you want to know how a distillery works, take it apart and put it together again. Every nut, bolt, valve, pump, washer. And we actually shed a lot of weight there as well. There's a lot of redundant pipe work, and it was really about, I think, taking Benriach back to basics. Just give me some stuff in and give me some stuff out. That was a bit as basic as we wanted it. Stripping back all the stuff that we didn't need. So yeah, we did shed a load of weight there, but a great experience. And as I mentioned there, not only getting it fit for purpose, the next stage of that was the little tweaks, the production tweaks. Let's dial in now. Let's dial in that production to where we want that new make spirit to be.
So in our Whisky Live at Home tasting packs, we have the 12, but I understand that you feel that to understand the 12 well, you really need to have also tasted the 10. So I was wondering if you could start off by telling us a little bit about the 10-year-old expression.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that's what you want. If you've got your, what I would say your flagship of your core range will be, it will be the 10 for us. And it's almost like, I always say, it's like hearing your child's first words, or watching your first footsteps, or it's like that's when your spirit is going it alone. And I think the 10s want to encapsulate what the distillery is about. And the 10 for me really does that, because we're looking at building these layers, but the focus should be on the distillery style, and actually maybe a nod to the heritage going back in the past to it as well. So in the 10, beautiful cask combination here. Lovely summer gold, just like the big blue skies and sunshine in Speyside. When I pop that cork, without a doubt it's Benriach. I don't even have to do much with it. Run it over my nose, you know that's Benriach. That's what you want from your start of your core range. That's signature notes. That's what you're looking for. 43% ABV. The rest of them are up at 46. But I think what we wanted here is almost to expose more of the luscious ripe fruits. So that little bit of dilution down to 43 just helps expose that a little bit more. Also, I think it exposes some other things in there. It elevates more of the honey notes, for example. We have woven in a very, very trace element of peat in here also, of peated smoky whiskey. And I think that little bit of reduction helps that come through. Higher ABV, maybe hide that or hold it back a little bit. So we're going to look for a lot of things in here. What is the Benriach style? Definitely orchard fruits, but more than that, it's real luscious ripe pears. Then the honey is just all over this and nose. So if you look at even these two things together, what is Benriach in this glass? It's honey poached pears. Simple. That's what I'm getting. That's a distillery. We are using bourbon barrels. For me, the bourbon is the base. There's three different casks. The bourbon is that base that we can start layering flavors on. Now, we know what we're going to get from American oak. We know we're going to get vanillas, cinnamon, toffees, all these lovely American oak characters. So when you combine that with honeyed poached pears, how can you go wrong, you know? So you're starting with this luscious, sweet balance. But then we can build. What we need to do is build some spice and some middle against that sweetness, because some cases that might be too sweet for some people. So we've got that bourbon base there. To build the spice, we're using some virgin oak. And this is something that we've done quite recently, is start taking the virgin oak cask from the cooperies in Alabama and in Louisville, so direct to us. And it's a project Rachel started working on when she first started, is finding the correct toasting and charring of these virgin oak barrels that will take that Benriach spirit and amplify what we're looking for, really honing down the charring and toasting to fit with that Benriach spirit. And that's what we're getting. When you put this in your tongue, the tip of your tongue, that lovely vibrancy. So you've got, and I always think sometimes an oak spice is difficult to describe as a flavour. It's more a sensation. So we've got the base, we've got that sensation in our tongue, bright, crisp, fresh. Doesn't get hot, doesn't get peppery. It then moves into more honeyed notes as it comes through the back of the palate. I'm just going to have a wee sip again. And actually, even the second sip, the third sip, that oak spice or that oak vibrancy goes back and the fruit gets more elevated. So almost sip by sip, this will change and almost get riper each time. Very creamy, very viscous. But there's another cask in here that we're looking for, which is the sherry cask. And this isn't a sherry bomb. We don't want it to be a sherry bomb. The sherry casks in here, I feel, just offer the balance, which actually helps that transition from the bourbon to the virgin oak. And possibly in the back of the palate, I think the sherry casks help keep the barley intact. Because you've got to remember, they're 500 litre casks. We're looking at 10, maybe 12 years if we're using older spirit in here. But we don't want that to be dark chocolates, raisins and dates. You know, we want that almost just to keep the richness of the barley of the Benriach style coming through, which it does. That comes through at the back of the palate. And then I did mention that we've added a little bit of peat in here. I can't get it in the nose. I actually don't even get it in the first or second or third taste. It's not until I sit, you know, I'm almost salivating at all these lovely, luscious, ripe fruit characters. And then probably only now I'm thinking, is that a little bit of smoke in there? You know, is that a little bit of smoke? I'm not quite sure, but is it a little bit of smoke? It's just a lovely trace at the back. And another thing that I think the peat does that also sometimes enhances other flavours. So sometimes you'll use peat in a whiskey not to actually get a smoky flavour, but almost to enhance. I think what we do in here is more of the honey notes. So even it's a strange kind of combination of flavours that by maybe adding another layer, you expose another layer of something else. And I think that's why I feel this one's got far more of that, richer honey texture as we go through it. So if that's a start off to the range, where are we going from here? Beautiful expression. I think Benriach has always been highly regarded by blenders throughout its history. They've known they could play with it, they could push it, they could combine it, and you're still going to remain, I think, that fruit element. But also, that's the reason they made the peated stuff in 72, to give an additional layer to blends back in the 70s. So we're very lucky just to have inherited all these pieces that we can now put together and play with. So yeah, beautiful expression, and I think very, very different in how we approach that, actually, combining these flavours.
So now we've talked a little bit about the 10 years old. Shall we have a little taste of the 12? So what's the 12 all about for you?
So when we go to the 12, we're still looking at a 3-cask combination. And I didn't mention, actually, another great thing is, we just say sherry when it talks about the sherry inclusion here. So we know that it's 3 casks. The first one, for example, bourbon, virgin oak, sherry. But you can even start imagining, well, what sherry? What style of sherry did we use? In the 10, I think it's quite evident that it was Oloroso, for example, because you don't have the typical dark notes of the PX. And that's going to keep even the refined element to the style. So the sherry cask used there, we will use both Oloroso and PX, but you can tell there, I think it's more predominantly Oloroso in its sherry contribution. Now, this is I think, if we look at the cask combination now, we're still looking at bourbon, sherry, but this time with the addition of port. Now, which one sherry are we using, and where does it come in? I think it's evident when you nose or taste this, the base this time, the foundation of this whiskey is the PX sherry. It's a lovely strong base to hold then the other characters. So that's what I think we should always be doing when we taste whiskies, even looking at which are the base flavours, which are the top notes, and try and even imagine, if you know the cask combinations, where they lie, what's their job in the range. And definitely there, you nose that, I think you could sound undoubtable. You could say, okay, it's got that richer chocolate note in there. It's got more of that orange, richness, even moving into cherries and the fruits. You will say in your head, okay, this isn't a bourbon foundation here this time. The foundation is more PX, Pedro Jimenez sherry.
Yeah, that's lovely. There's some wonderful chocolate notes coming through there, and some real rich red berry notes as well, sort of cranberries and blackberries. It's really very rich.
And I think that's where the bourbon comes in then, the ex-bourbon barrels. So if you just put all this in PX sherry and in port, now they're big hefty flavours. So what I think this time, the bourbon barrel contribution is letting it say, I'm still Benriach. The bourbon barrels and the classic DNA of the spirit is the one that's saying, yeah, I'm Benriach. This is the I'm Benriach. It's keeping it honest.
Yeah, but it's still wonderfully elegant, though. Even though it's got these three different cask types going on in there, and I think there's perhaps a tendency when people see 3 casks matured to worry that, oh God, has this whiskey been sort of clobbered with wood or overwhelmed by the cask? But no, it's actually quite a light touch. It's very, very well integrated. It's very elegant, and no one cask type is sort of completely overwhelming it. And the spirit character is definitely there too.
And again, it's a very autumnal whiskey. I love the autumnal feeling of this. It is all about these dark autumn fruits. It's funny when you say cranberry. Cranberry is always a note I've pulled up with port casks. So again, if you try and then, we know that foundation here is going to be the PX. Beautiful, the chocolate orange, even more of the cherries. You do get some beautiful fruits from Pedro Jimenez as well. The bourbon is the Benriach, I'm here part, and then when it goes into what you're getting from the port, we're just tweaking the fruits, giving you another layer. I think it's got more cherries than ever. I think that's maybe due to the port. I think that, as you mentioned, the cranberry notes, that little, maybe let's say a more red berry jammy compote. That's that lovely essence of the port cask. But there's also something we're looking for here, and I think this tastes far beyond its years. And it's almost thinking about, how do we bring in the spice again? How do we get a contrast against all these big fruits, all that big sweetness? This time we're using the tannins. So we're being very careful. And I think maybe more to do with the port pipes, because they're the largest cask, 600 litres. We've got a lovely interaction of the tannins from the oak as well as the enriching fruits of the port. And I think that just comes maybe towards the end of the finish, and this lovely dryness, that kind of that vintage dryness you'd be looking for in an old whiskey, just in the tongue, comfortably on the tongue. That's where Benriach wins. I think the broad shoulders I mentioned of the spirit, you know, you can put a lot of weight on it and it can carry it. It really can. It's a master blender's dream, you know, spirit-wise. Also, you look at what we've done in the past. You know, we've been working with wine casks for the past 16 years. So we know what works. We know where to push them. We're never just going to do a 6 months, then out, then in bottle. You know, we'll push. So even when Rachel looks into the warehouse, she's got a fantastic combination of different, almost times in each of these casks, as far as the finished element. So the bourbon's fully matured, the sherry, Oloroso's fully matured. But when it comes to the secondary cask like the port, she could be choosing something that's been 9 years or 3 years. And again, that also gives her the tools to bring together in a perfect balance, rather than just being stuck with one finishing time in one barrel. So it just broadens her ingredients. Her larder's bigger than anybody else's.
Yeah, it's got a wonderful finish. The fruits carry right through to the end. It's a remarkably long finish as well. I'm really enjoying this.
I really think the barley shines at the back as well. You know, it shines in the back of the 10. I think that barley is a more stewed barley, let's say, but it's still there. It's more of the baked fruits, and it moves into that baked fruits and stewed rich barley notes. I just love this. And sometimes even when you look at the length of a whiskey, you can count in your head 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This is still going. You know, a minute, 2 minutes after it, you just really coat your mouth. And I think that's where I've seen a big difference in the combinations now. They seem to be fuller bodied on the palate, so they've got a richer mouthfeel, even the oils wise. But that's also just extended the length. They just go on forever.
Well, thank you so much for taking us through the 12, Stuart. But before we wrap up, I'd really like to hear a little bit more about the rest of the range, because it is a big change from what there was before, and there's quite a lot of different things going on in there, lots of different cask types, some smoky, some not smoky. So it'd be great if you could just take us through that quickly.
Yes, it has been great, because almost some of the expressions have been an evolution of a historical expression, and just, you know, different combinations. So the 10 is probably an evolution of the previous 10, but just richer. So it's almost taking the old 10 up a gear, filling that out, more virgin oak actually in there, giving it a richer, deeper body. Then the one I love actually is the smoky 10. It's almost like the old Curiositas, and the old Curiositas had changed in many forms. It at the start was just second fill bourbon and some hogsheads, and then it went to virgin oak and hogsheads. So it evolved all the way through the last 16 years, and laterally we started using some rum barrels in there. So with this new smoky 10, it's the same combination of casks, but again pushed forward. So higher contribution of virgin oak, and also a higher contribution of the rum barrels that we had previously. That is just amazing. It's like taking a slice of pineapple and covering it in maple syrup and smacking it on the barbecue. You know, absolutely amazing, sweet smoke, fruity expression, absolutely beautiful. We did try the 12, 3 layers in there, the PX sherry base, lovely bourbon line coming through it, then that rich port fruits at the back, sublime. And then the other one I think that's really intriguing is a combination that we haven't used before, which is the Smoky 12. And we have done fantastic work with many different wine styles in the warehouse over the last 16 years, but one of my favourites, although we've never used it in a core range, is Marsala. So Rachel's looked at the Marsala cask we've been working on over the years and really weaving that into the Smoky 12. So the Smoky 12 is an amazing balance, still looking at the bourbon and then the sherry, Oloroso and PX. But what I love about that is not one of them shout. The stage really is formed by the bourbon, the sherry coming together. There's no one dominance there, which I think really lets the Marsala sing. So the Marsala is put on the stage, and the notes you get from that is phenomenal. You're just moving into, you know, richer, darker notes, baked oranges, lovely spicier vanillins. The layers you get in the Smoky 12 are just beyond belief. Then take obviously that lovely sweet wood smoke we've got running through it as well. So I can't find my favourite, but for the core range expressions at the moment, between the 10s and 12s, you can't go wrong. We are going to bottle up some older vintages as well. They're actually just going down to the distillery at the moment, from the distillery at the moment. We'll have a 21, a 25 and a 30. They'll all be 4 cask combinations: bourbon, virgin oak, sherry, then 8 and other, as being, for example, the 21 will be red wine, the 25 will be Madeira, and the 30 will be using some port casks again. So even when we go into the older vintages, you'll still see this fantastic layering of flavours. All of these will actually contain some level of peat at one stage or another. So we might be describing as elegant or rich or intense. So you can really get almost a 101 of how peat ages by going through these old vintages as well. So I'm looking forward to getting them in bottle. So yeah, still a lot to look out for, but it's going to be a great coming year to finally get Benriach all on the shelf in this beautiful packaging. I've been smiling from ear to ear for the last month since they were released. It's a happy, fun whiskey, and that's what people should remember. Whiskey's about having fun. These whiskies are fun to talk about, to experience, to dive into, to learn from, actually. So they're good, fun whiskies. That's what we want to do in, I think, the industry, isn't it?